them for. You know what he should have said when they came in? We doing it his album. This is all a social media skit. We already took out the blogs to post this. We doing it his album. We doing this his album. And if you my artist, I'ma sue y'all. If you arrest my artist, I'ma sue y'all. Gucci know what the did. Everybody trying to sugarcoat.
What if everything you've been preaching suddenly gets flipped back on you? Because right now, that's exactly what's happening. One interview, one moment, and now the internet is asking a question nobody saw coming. Did Boosie just expose himself while trying to call someone else out? This isn't just another industry rant. This is different. This feels personal, heated, unfiltered, and maybe a little too honest. Because while going off on Gucci Mane, laying down strict rules about loyalty, street codes, and what makes someone a rat, Boosie might have said something that completely changed the narrative. Something that didn't just point fingers, but circled right back to him. Now fans are digging. Clips are resurfacing. Old situations are being re-examined. And the same standards Boosie used to judge others, people are now applying them to him, with zero mercy. And here's where it gets messy. Money is involved. A lot of it. Family is involved. And when you mix money, loyalty, and public statements together, things don't stay simple for long. Because now the question isn't just about Gucci. It's bigger than that. It's about consistency. It's about principles. And it's about whether the same code applies when you are the one under pressure. So what really happened behind this interview? Did Boosie stand on his beliefs or accidentally contradict everything he's been saying? And more importantly, when the spotlight turns on you, do your words still hold up? Let's break this all the way down. And that's exactly where things start to get uncomfortable. Because once that question is out there, once people begin to look at your words and your actions side by side, there's no controlling how the narrative unfolds next. The moment didn't feel planned. It didn't feel calculated. It felt raw, emotional, like something that was building up for a long time and finally spilled out. And that's usually when the most revealing statements come out. Not when someone is prepared, but when they're reacting. When Boosie started speaking on Gucci Mane, it didn't sound like a casual opinion. It sounded like frustration. Real frustration. The kind that comes from feeling like someone crossed a line you personally believe should never be crossed. And he didn't hold back. He questioned decisions. He questioned behavior. He questioned principles. And most importantly, he questioned consistency. That was the core of everything he was saying, not just what happened, but whether it aligned with the code that's often talked about in the culture. But here's where things shifted. Because the more he spoke, the more people started connecting dots. At first, the focus was entirely on Gucci. The accusations, the tone, the energy, it all pointed in one direction. But as the interview continued, something subtle started happening. The conversation expanded. It stopped being just about one person and started becoming about standards. Standards that don't just apply to one situation, but to everyone. And that's when the attention turned. Not because people wanted to attack, but because they started asking a simple question. If these are the rules, do they apply across the board? Because when Boosie talked about money not being enough reason to involve certain actions, that statement didn't exist in isolation. It triggered memory. It triggered past situations. It triggered moments that people had already seen, already heard, already discussed. And suddenly, the conversation wasn't just about what was said in that interview. It became about everything connected to it. This is how narratives evolve in real time. One statement leads to another. One point leads to a comparison. And before you know it, the entire situation is being viewed from multiple angles at once. Some people saw it as justified frustration. From their perspective, Boosie was simply calling out what he believed was wrong, standing on principles, speaking openly, not sugarcoating anything. And in a world where a lot of people stay quiet, that kind of directness stands out. But others saw something completely different. They saw contradiction. They saw a shift in standards depending on the situation. And that's where the tension started building. Because once people sense inconsistency, they don't let it go easily, especially not online. And that's exactly what started happening. Clips began circulating. Old moments were brought back into focus. Situations that may have seemed unrelated before were now being placed side by side, compared, analyzed, and broken down in ways that weren't happening before this interview. And the more people looked, the more questions they had. because now it wasn't just about one situation anymore. It was about a pattern, or at least what people believe could be a pattern. The discussion started shifting into something deeper, not just actions, but intent. Not just what happened, but why it happened, and whether the reasoning behind those decisions lined up with the principles being spoken about so strongly. And that's where things get complicated, because intent is harder to prove than action. Anyone can point at what happened, but understanding why someone made a decision, that's where interpretation takes over. And once interpretation enters the conversation, there is no single truth, only perspectives. Some argued that situations involving large amounts of money naturally become more complex. That when financial stakes are high, decisions that might seem simple on the surface become much more layered behind the scenes. Others pushed back on that completely. Their argument was clear: if the code is the code, then it shouldn't change based on circumstances. Whether it's a small situation or a major one, the principle should remain the same. And that's the part that kept the conversation alive. Because no matter which side someone agreed with, the central issue remained unresolved. Consistency. That word kept coming up again and again. Not loudly, not aggressively, but persistently. Because in situations like this, consistency becomes the measuring stick. It's what people use to determine credibility. It's what shapes perception. And once that gets questioned, everything else starts to feel uncertain. Even statements that might have made sense on their own begin to sound different when placed next to past actions. And that's exactly what happened here. The focus didn't stay on the accusations. It moved to alignment. Do the words match the actions? Do the standards stay the same? Or do they shift depending on the situation? These aren't easy questions to answer. And that's why the debate didn't slow down. If anything, it intensified. Because every new clip, every new breakdown, every new opinion added another layer to the conversation. And none of those layers fully replaced the others. They all existed at the same time, creating a narrative that felt constantly evolving. Meanwhile, the emotional side of the situation didn't disappear either. Because beneath all the analysis, all the comparisons, all the debates, there was still something very real driving everything. Frustration. Frustration over money. Frustration over loyalty. Frustration over how situations are handled when pressure is involved. And when frustration is that strong, it doesn't stay controlled. It comes out in ways that aren't always perfectly aligned, perfectly structured, or perfectly consistent. And that's what makes moments like this so revealing. Because they show not just what someone believes, but how they react when those beliefs are challenged in real time. And once that reaction is public, it becomes part of the narrative forever. Now the situation isn't just about what was said. It's about how it's being interpreted. And interpretation is something no one can fully control, which means this story is far from over. And once a story reaches that point, it stops being something you can steer and starts becoming something you have to react to. Because now, every new angle that gets introduced doesn't replace the last one, it stacks on top of it. The narrative gets heavier, more layered, more complicated. And the people watching? They're no longer just listening. They're judging, comparing, and deciding for themselves what makes sense and what doesn't. That's exactly where this situation sits right now. Not settled, not clarified, just expanding. Because the deeper people looked into it, the more they started pulling in details that weren't even part of the original moment. Old situations, past decisions, stories that had already happened but never fully connected, until now. And suddenly, everything felt linked. That's when the conversation started shifting toward the situation involving Boosie's own circle, something that, on its own, might have been treated as a separate issue. But in this context, it became central, because now people weren't just asking what he said, they were asking how it compares. And when comparisons start, that's when things get intense. The discussion around money came back into focus, not just as a detail, but as a driving force. Because when large amounts of money are involved, people naturally start questioning motives. Not in a simple way, but in a layered way. They ask what someone would do, what they wouldn't do, and where they draw the line. But here's the problem. That line didn't look the same to everyone. Some argued that losing a major financial opportunity, something worth millions, changes everything. That it's not just about principles anymore. It's about survival, business, and protecting what's yours. Others didn't accept that at all. Their perspective was blunt. If you claim to stand on certain rules, those rules shouldn't bend when the stakes get higher. In fact, they should matter even more. And that disagreement is what kept the situation alive. Because neither side backed down. One side focused on reality, the pressure, the money, the personal impact. The other side focused on consistency, the words, the standards, the expectations. And in the middle of that was Boosie, not just as the person speaking, but as the person being analyzed. Every statement he made started getting re-examined, not just in isolation, but in context. People weren't just listening to what he said in that moment. They were comparing it to everything he had said before. And that's when the conversation got even more personal. Because once family enters the picture, everything changes. The situation involving his brother didn't just add detail, it added emotion. It added history. It added complexity that couldn't be simplified into a single argument. Now, the narrative wasn't just about industry behavior. It was about personal decisions. And personal decisions are always harder to judge. Because people understand that family situations aren't simple. They're layered with loyalty, betrayal, trust, and emotion all at the same time. What looks like a clear decision from the outside might feel completely different on the inside. But even with that understanding, the questions didn't stop. If anything, they became sharper. Because now people were looking at two situations side by side and asking one unavoidable question. What's the real difference? That question doesn't come with an easy answer. Because both situations, when broken down, involve pressure, consequences, and decisions made under stress. Both involve something at stake. Both involve reactions that could be interpreted in multiple ways. But the way they're being judged, that's where the divide is. Some see them as completely different situations. Others see them as fundamentally the same. And that split in perception is what keeps the conversation going. Because when people can't agree on the basics, every new detail becomes another point of debate. And that debate doesn't just stay in one place. It spreads across platforms, across audiences, across different perspectives. One clip leads to another. One opinion leads to 10 more. And before long, the situation isn't just a topic anymore. It's a cycle of reaction, analysis, and reinterpretation that feeds itself. And the more it feeds, the harder it becomes to slow down. Meanwhile, something else starts happening quietly in the background. Credibility begins to shift, not in a dramatic, instant way, but gradually. Because credibility isn't just about what you say. It's about whether people believe it holds up over time. And when consistency is questioned, credibility naturally gets pulled into that conversation. Not because it disappears completely, but because it becomes uncertain. Some people still stand firmly behind Boosie's perspective. To them, his frustration is valid, his points make sense, and the situations being compared are not equal. Others are more skeptical. They're not fully rejecting what he's saying, but they're not fully accepting it either. They're watching, waiting, looking for clarity that hasn't fully arrived yet. And that uncertainty, that's what keeps attention locked in. Because people don't walk away from unresolved questions. They stay engaged. They keep watching. They keep debating. And they keep revisiting the same points, trying to make sense of them from different angles. That's why this situation hasn't faded. It hasn't reached a conclusion. It hasn't been wrapped up with a clear answer. Instead, it's sitting in that space where everything is still being interpreted, where every new piece of information doesn't close the story, it expands it. And that expansion changes how everything is viewed moving forward. Because now, this isn't just about one interview. It's about what that interview triggered. It's about how quickly a narrative can shift when past and present collide. It's about how standards are tested when pressure is applied. And most importantly, it's about how perception can change when people start asking questions that don't have easy answers. At this point, the story isn't being driven by a single voice anymore. It's being driven by everyone watching it. And once that happens, control is no longer part of the equation. Only reaction is. And reactions are still coming. And that's exactly why this situation still hasn't cooled off. Because even after everything that's already been said, the biggest question is still sitting there unanswered. And the longer it stays unanswered, the louder it gets. At this point, people aren't just reacting to clips anymore. They're building their own conclusions. They're replaying moments, comparing statements, and connecting details in ways that go far beyond the original interview. What started as one heated conversation has now turned into a full breakdown of credibility, principles, and personal decisions, all happening in real time. And the pressure from that kind of attention, it doesn't fade quietly. It builds. Because once the internet locks onto a narrative like this, it doesn't just let it go. It keeps digging until it feels like every angle has been explored, and even then, it still looks for more. That's where things stand now. Not at a resolution, but at a peak. Because now the focus isn't just on what Boosie said, it's on whether those words can survive scrutiny, whether they hold the same weight when flipped around and applied back to him. And that's a completely different level of pressure. Because it's one thing to call someone else out. It's another thing entirely when the same spotlight turns back on you. And that spotlight right now, it's intense. Some people are doubling down in support, saying the situations being compared are not the same. That context matters. That details matter. That not every decision falls under the same category, no matter how similar it might look from the outside. And to them, this entire situation is being overanalyzed, stretched beyond what it actually represents. But on the other side, there's no hesitation at all. They're saying the comparison is valid, that the same standards should apply across the board, that you can't define a code one way for others and then adjust it when it becomes personal. And that's the argument that keeps cutting through everything else. Not louder, but sharper. Because it's simple. And simple questions are the hardest to avoid. What are the rules? And do they apply equally? That's it. That's what everything keeps coming back to. Not the emotions. Not the tone. Not even the original accusations. Just that one idea. Consistency. And the reason it matters so much is because consistency is what people use to measure authenticity. It's what builds trust over time. It's what separates opinion from principle. So when that gets questioned, everything else becomes uncertain. Even strong statements start to feel unstable. Even clear opinions start to feel debatable. And once that shift happens, the conversation doesn't move forward. It loops. Back to the same points. Back to the same comparisons. Back to the same unanswered questions. And every time it loops, it pulls more attention in. More people join the discussion. More perspectives get added. More interpretations start forming. And the story keeps growing, without actually moving toward an ending. Because the truth is, this situation doesn't have a clean finish. There's no single statement that can wrap it up. No one response that can settle both sides. Because at its core, this isn't just about what happened. It's about how people choose to see what happened. And that choice? It's different for everyone. Some people are looking at the bigger picture, the money, the pressure, the personal factors behind the decisions. They see complexity. They see reasons why situations can't always be judged the same way. Others are looking at it from a strict standpoint. The words that were said, the standards that were set, and whether those standards stayed consistent when tested. Neither side is fully wrong, but neither side fully agrees. And that disagreement is what keeps everything alive. Because as long as there's no clear agreement, there's no closure. Just ongoing conversation. And that conversation doesn't stay contained. It spreads into future discussions. It becomes a reference point. Moment people come back to when similar situations happen again. That's how narratives like this evolve. They don't just exist in the moment. They leave a mark. And right now, that mark is still being formed. Because the reactions aren't slowing down. The opinions aren't settling. And the questions? They're still being asked. Over and over again. Until something changes. Or until people decide their own answers are enough. But until that happens, this story stays exactly where it is. Open, debated, and impossible to ignore. If you made it this far, then you already know this isn't just another story. It's a debate that's not ending anytime soon. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think Boosie Badazz stayed consistent with what he's been preaching? Or did he contradict himself when the pressure hit? And when it comes to Gucci Mane, was that situation really different? Or are people just picking sides?